Imagine being born with a debt that you never bought. Before you even take your first step, you already owe thousands of taka. This is not science fiction. This is the reality of our public debt.
Every year, our government spends more than it earns to fill the gap it borrows, creating what we call public debt. But who really pays for it? Not just today's taxpayers, but our future generations, our children and their children.
And that brings us to today's big question: public debt and future generations. Who will pay for today's fiscal deficit? Now, the question is, what is public debt and how it affects future generations? Public debt is the total money a government owes to the creditors, both domestic and foreign, because it spends more than it collects in taxes and revenue. To cover this gap, the government borrows through loan, bond, or foreign. In simple words, it's the country's credit bill.
But there's the problem. When the government borrows today, it is future citizens who bear the burden. Higher debt can result in increased taxes to repay interest and principal, reduce public services as a large portion of the budget goes to debt payments, inflation and currency depreciation if borrowing is mismanaged, and slower economic growth as government borrowing crowds but private investment. In other words, borrowing today can come at the cost of tomorrow's opportunities. Debt is more than just numbers on a balance sheet. It affects the lives, education, and prospects of people who have no say in the decisions being made today. In short, public debt is more than numbers on a ledger. It's a legacy. Borrowing can support today's needs, but if mismanaged, it becomes a burden for tomorrow's citizen.
Now, let's bring this home. Bangladesh public debt now stands at about 40.1% of GDP in 2024. Our external debt stock is about 22.3% of GNI, and in 2023, 8% of our export earning went just to service debt. To put it simply, out of every $100 of Bangladesh earned from export, $8 are immediately used just to pay back the previous loan. This is a huge burden. In fact, if you divide Bangladesh total debt equally, each citizen, men, women, and child carries about $100,000 on their shoulder.
If we look at the US national debt, it is around $36 to $37 trillion in 2025, which equals about 120% of its GDP. That's almost 3 times Bangladesh's debt ratio. But on paper, America looks far worse. But here's the difference. The US borrows in its own currency, the dollar, still the world's reserve currency, so it has far more flexibility. Bangladesh, on the other hand, borrows heavily in foreign currencies, which makes us vulnerable to exchange rate swings and global interest rate hikes.
While Bangladesh has a lower absolute debt level and much lower percentage of GDP than the US, its external debt service burden relative to its export and GNI is significant. The burden of servicing that debt, especially the external debt, can squeeze growth, and particularly for a developing country. If Bangladesh implements these reforms, the debt to GDP ratio will grow more slowly, making borrowing more sustainable. Lower debt services cost will free up funds for essential services like school, hospital, and infrastructure. The economy will strengthen through productive investment rather than reliance on borrowing credit. Ratings will improve, reducing future borrowing costs. And most importantly, the financial burden on future generations will be lighter.
For example, Ireland in the 1980s faced debt above 110% of a GDP. Early tax hikes slowed growth. Later, the government cut wasteful spending, focused on exports, and implemented credible policies. Confidence returned, investment grew, and debt fell. This shows that smart reforms plus growth can reduce debt without extreme measures.
So, how can Bangladesh manage its debt better? Let's look at some effective policies.
Bangladesh needs to broaden its tax base and improve collection. For example, countries like Vietnam increase revenue by digitalizing tax systems and reducing loopholes. Progressive taxation would ensure the wealthy contribute more fairly. Government funds must go into high-return areas: education, healthcare, and export-linked infrastructure. For instance, South Korea's investment in human capital paid off with higher growth and fast debt repayment.
Okay, so Bangladesh should rely more on consensual loans with low interest and finance major infrastructure projects. And every taka borrowed must fund projects that generate economic returns, or not just to cover the recurrent expenses.
Controlling inflation and stabilizing the taka against the dollar will reduce repayment pressure. Maintaining strong foreign reserves gives Bangladesh breathing space during global crisis. Bangladesh should establish a stabilization fund like Chile's Cooper Revenue Fund, which helps cushion the economy in times of crisis. If Bangladesh implements these reforms, debt growth will slow, borrowing costs will fall, resources can be redirected to development. The economy will grow through productive investment, credit ratings will improve, and the future generations will bear a lighter burden.
So, debt is not always a curse. It can be a tool for growth if we use wisely. But unmanaged debt steals opportunities from tomorrow to pay for today. So, our challenge is clear. We must borrow responsibly, spend efficiently, and ensure that future generations inherit prosperity, not liabilities. We hope this helps you to understand
Who really will pay for today's deficit if steps are not taken? All we can say is that borrow wisely, grow responsibly for our children.